I looked up from the hospital chair after 73 sleepless nights when a man in a navy suit quietly asked, "Mrs. Evelyn Carter, before I say anything else, has anyone told you what happened to your father's house?" My hands froze around the paper cup of cold coffee. My mother was breathing through an oxygen mask only a few feet away. Machines filled the room with soft, rhythmic beeps. I had forgotten what a full night's sleep felt like. My husband had told me not to worry about paperwork. He had promised me he was handling everything while I stayed beside my dying mother. I believed him. I nodded without understanding. The man lowered his voice. "I'm the family attorney. There are documents you need to see, immediately." I was 39 years old. "My name is Evelyn Carter." And that was the first moment I realized the people I trusted most had been planning a future that didn't include me. But this story does not start here. Welcome back to Revenge Cold Stories. Drop your first name and your city in the comments and subscribe before we go any further. It started decades earlier, in a white farmhouse just outside a quiet Pennsylvania town, where my father believed two things solved almost every problem: work and honesty. When I was 8 years old, my father, Daniel Carter, woke me before sunrise on the first Saturday of every month. At exactly 6:15 in the morning, he would knock twice on my bedroom door and say the same sentence: "Character is built before breakfast." At the time, I hated hearing those words. The winter air strung my face as we walked across the property carrying old toolboxes that were older than I was. The farmhouse sat on just under 12 acres of land. It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't even particularly beautiful. Paint peeled from the porch railing every spring, the roof always seemed to need another repair, and one side of the old red barn leaned just enough to make visitors nervous. But to my father, every nail, every fence post, and every tree represented a promise. He used to kneel beside me while repairing broken boards and explain that homes weren't valuable because of their market price. They're valuable because they remember people. I didn't understand that sentence until much later. My mother, Margaret, was different. She believed kindness was something you practiced quietly. She volunteered every Thursday at the church pantry for nearly 27 years. She somehow remembered everyone's birthdays, favorite meals, allergies and worries without ever writing anything down. People often called her ordinary. They were wrong. She simply never advertised how extraordinary she was. Growing up, our family wasn't wealthy. Some years my parents delayed replacing old appliances because college savings came first. Some Christmas mornings included handmade gifts instead of expensive ones. Some vacations consisted of camping less than 30 miles from home. Yet I never remember feeling poor. I remember feeling safe. By the time I graduated high school, my father had managed to pay off the remaining mortgage on the farmhouse after nearly 29 years of monthly payments. I still remember the evening he carried the final receipt into the kitchen. He didn't celebrate with champagne. He quietly placed the paid-off mortgage papers inside a small fireproof box and smiled at my mother. "We own our future now." Those words stayed with me. I earned a scholarship to study accounting at a state university. I graduated with honors. By 32, I had become a senior financial controller at a manufacturing company with more than 400 employees. I supervised annual operating budgets exceeding $68 million, managed audit teams of 12 professionals, and earned enough that I never needed financial help from anyone. Ironically, everyone outside my family respected my judgment with money. Inside my family, I was still treated like the little girl who supposedly didn't understand how the real world worked. Then I met Nathan Brooks. Nathan was charming in a way that made everyone immediately comfortable. He laughed easily, remembered people's names, held doors open, volunteered to help neighbors move furniture. He never seemed controlling. He simply enjoyed being the person who solved problems. Or at least that's what I believed. We married when I was 34. For the first several years, our marriage looked successful from the outside. No dramatic arguments. No screaming matches. No obvious betrayals. Just small decisions that slowly became habits. Nathan insisted on handling insurance paperwork because he understood legal language better. He preferred managing conversations with contractors because he said I worked too much already. Whenever official documents arrived, he'd casually say, "Don't worry, I'll take care of it." It sounded caring. Looking back, I realized something important. Control rarely introduces itself as control. It usually arrives disguised as convenience. Nathan had one older sister, Linda Brooks. She was 46, confident, perfectly dressed, always speaking with absolute certainty. Linda believed life rewarded people who acted decisively. In her mind, hesitation meant weakness. She admired people who won. She rarely questioned how they won. Our relationship stayed polite for years because we rarely disagreed directly. Instead, she made comments that seemed harmless on the surface. "Evelyn's sweet. Evelyn trusts everybody. Evelyn thinks everyone follows rules." People laughed, including me, because I thought she was joking. My father never liked those jokes. One Thanksgiving, after Linda repeated that I was too trusting for modern life, my father quietly replied from the other end of the table, "Trust isn't weakness." The room became silent. It's giving someone the opportunity to prove who they really are. Linda smiled politely. Nathan changed the subject. Nobody argued. But I noticed something. Nathan squeezed Linda's shoulder as we were leaving that evening. Not affectionately. Almost. Appreciatively. At the time, I ignored it. Life moved on. Then everything changed within 6 months. My father suffered a massive heart attack. He survived only 9 days. His funeral drew more than 200 people. Former co-workers, neighbors, church friends, young families he had quietly helped over the years. Standing beside his grave, I realized how many lives one honest man could touch without ever talking about it. My mother changed after losing him. Not emotionally at first. Physically. Within weeks she seemed smaller. Quieter. Then came the diagnosis. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors estimated between 6 and 12 months. They were wrong. She declined much faster. I immediately requested extended leave from work. My company approved nearly 4 months under family medical leave. Every morning I drove 48 minutes to the hospital. Every evening I returned after dark. Sometimes I slept in the reclining chair beside her bed. Nathan encouraged me. "Stay with your mom," he would say. "I'll handle everything else." I thanked him every single time. Those words became the foundation of the biggest mistake of my life. During those months, my entire world became measured in tiny changes. The number on my mother's heart monitor. How much soup she could finish before feeling exhausted. Whether she smiled when I walked into the room. Whether she remembered what day it was. Nothing outside that hospital seemed important anymore. Nathan made sure I believed that. Every evening he'd call around 7:30. "How's your mom?" "About the same." "Don't worry about the house, I paid the property taxes today." "No." "I met with the insurance company." "No." "I signed the paperwork the county needed." Every conversation ended the same way. "You stay where you're needed." I never questioned what paperwork meant. There always seemed to be another form after someone died, another signature, another tax notice, another insurance update. My father had handled those things for decades, and after he passed away, Nathan naturally stepped into that role. At least that's how it looked. Looking back, I can now identify the exact moments I should have asked more questions. But grief narrows your vision. You stop thinking about next year. You stop thinking about legal documents. You think about making sure your mother isn't alone when she wakes up frightened at 3 in the morning. One afternoon, While I was helping my mother sip a few spoonfuls of broth, she suddenly looked at me with surprising clarity. Evelyn. Yes, Mom. Your father worried about the house. I smiled gently. It's fine, Nathan's taking care of everything. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stared out the hospital window. After nearly a minute, she quietly asked, Did your father ever give you the blue envelope? I frowned. What blue envelope? She looked confused. I thought. Then she shook her head. I'm tired. Within minutes, she was asleep again. I assumed the medication had made her disoriented. I didn't ask again. That conversation would replay in my mind hundreds of times later. Because I would eventually learn there really had been a blue envelope. And my father had hidden it for a reason. Meanwhile, Nathan and Linda had become unusually close. Family members even joked about it. They're always planning something. Nathan would laugh. We're just trying to help keep everything organized. No one questioned it. Linda had experience with rental properties. Nathan claimed he was learning from her. It sounded perfectly reasonable. My Aunt Carol once called me after seeing Nathan and Linda leaving the county records office together. I thought you were meeting them. I wasn't. Though, there was a brief silence. I guess they're handling estate paperwork. I answered confidently. Yes, Nathan mentioned that. Another opportunity passed without suspicion. Then came the first remark that should have shattered my trust. We gathered at Linda's house one Sunday for a small family lunch. I arrived late after spending nearly 11 hours at the hospital. I was exhausted. Nathan was already there. As I walked toward the dining room, I heard laughter before anyone noticed me. Linda said casually, If Evelyn actually read documents before signing them, she'd probably be dangerous. Several people laughed. Nathan laughed too. Not loudly. Just enough. I stepped into the room. The conversation stopped instantly. What did I miss? I asked. Linda smiled. Oh, nothing. Nathan kissed my forehead. We were talking about taxes. I accepted the explanation. Because I trusted him. Trust has a strange way of protecting the people who don't deserve it. Over the next few weeks, Nathan occasionally brought papers to the hospital. I just need one signature. What is it? Routine estate filings. Anything important? No. I signed them sitting beside my mother's hospital bed, while nurses walked in and out of the room. Sometimes I barely read the first page. Sometimes I didn't even finish reading the title. I hated paperwork during those months. Every document seemed connected to losing someone. Nathan knew that. And he used it. My mother passed away on a quiet Thursday morning at 5:42. I was holding her hand. The room was almost completely silent. She opened her eyes once, managed a tiny smile, and whispered, "Home." It was the last word she ever spoke. After the funeral, life became strangely empty. People stopped calling every day. The casseroles stopped arriving. Sympathy slowly faded. Everyone returned to their normal routines. Except me. I walked through my parents' farmhouse alone for the first time in weeks. Every room carried memories. My father's reading chair. My mother's handwritten recipes still attached to the refrigerator with faded magnets. Their bedroom remained exactly as they'd left it. I cried harder that afternoon than I had at either funeral. Nathan wrapped his arms around me. We'll figure everything out. I believed him. 3 days later, he suggested something unexpected. Linda wants to host a family dinner this Saturday. So soon. It'll be good for you. I don't feel like celebrating. It isn't a celebration. It's family. He insisted gently. Finally, I agreed. I had no idea that dinner had already been carefully planned. Not to comfort me, but to convince everyone that I was too distracted to notice what had already been stolen. And before dessert was served, the biggest lie of my marriage would begin to unravel. Saturday evening felt strangely rehearsed from the moment Nathan and I pulled into Linda's driveway. There were far more cars than I expected. Not just immediate family. A few cousins. Nathan's uncle Richard. Linda's longtime friends. Even 2 neighbors who had known the Brooks family for years. It didn't feel like a quiet family dinner. It felt like an audience. I ignored the feeling. Grief makes you doubt yourself before you doubt other people. Linda greeted everyone with effortless confidence. "There she is," she said, hugging me tightly. "You've been through so much." The hug lasted exactly long enough for everyone to see it. Then she whispered into my ear. "Tonight don't worry about business, just relax." Business? I hadn't mentioned business. I smiled politely and walked inside. The dining table was beautifully arranged. Fine china. Fresh flowers. Candles. Nathan poured wine for everyone except me. "You've had a rough few months," he said. "Maybe tea would be better." It sounded thoughtful. Looking back, I realized he wanted me to stay quiet and appear emotionally fragile. Dinner began with ordinary conversation. Work, children, vacations, weather. No one mentioned my parents. No one asked how I was coping. Instead, the conversation slowly drifted toward property values. Richard commented that land prices in the county had nearly doubled over the past decade. Linda nodded. "Timing is everything." Nathan agreed. "If people wait too long, opportunities disappear." Then Linda looked directly at me. "I suppose not everyone understands those things." A few uncomfortable smiles appeared around the table. I simply continued eating. Nathan reached over and squeezed my hand. His smile looked supportive. Now I know it was reassurance, not for me. For himself. About 20 minutes later, dessert was served. Apple pie. My mother's recipe. Linda announced proudly that she'd made it exactly the way Margaret used to. I stared at the pie. My mother had never given Linda that recipe. Only meat. I suddenly wondered how she had gotten it. Before I could ask, Linda lifted her glass. "I think it's time we acknowledge something." The room became quiet. Nathan has carried an enormous burden these past few months. Everyone nodded. He handled the legal work, the finances, the paperwork, while Evelyn understandably focused on the hospital. Nathan lowered his head modestly. "I only did what any husband would." Maury nods. Then Linda smiled. "Some people are wonderful caregivers." She looked at me. "But they aren't always practical." A cousin chuckled awkwardly. Linda continued. "If Nathan hadn't stepped in, that old farmhouse would probably have become a financial disaster." Someone laughed softly. Another relative added. "Evelyn was never interested in legal matters anyway. I've always said she's too trusting. She's got a good heart, but not much business sense." The comments came one after another. None of them shouted. None of them sounded cruel. That's what made them hurt even more. Each sentence treated me like a child sitting at the adult's table. Nathan never interrupted. He never defended me. He simply smiled into his coffee. Then Linda delivered the sentence I still remember word for word. "Honestly, Evelyn is lucky Nathan was smart enough to protect the property before she accidentally lost it." The table erupted in polite laughter. I looked at Nathan. He didn't look surprised. He looked relieved. As though everyone had finally accepted a story he had spent months creating. I quietly asked, "What property?" The laughter faded. Nathan answered casually, "Your father's house." "My father's house." It was complicated. What do you mean? Linda leaned back confidently. It isn't really something you need to worry about anymore. The room became perfectly silent. I looked from one face to another. What does that mean? Nathan finally spoke. I transferred everything where it would be, safer. My stomach tightened. What exactly did you transfer? He hesitated for the first time all evening. The title. My heartbeat seemed to stop. The title to whose name? No one answered immediately. Then Linda smiled. Mine. Silence. Absolute silence. I actually thought I had misheard her. You put my father's house. Nathan interrupted gently. It was only temporary. In your sister's name. It was the safest option. Without asking me. You were overwhelmed. I signed as your husband. My hands slowly moved away from the table. I never agreed to that. Nathan spoke calmly, almost like explaining something to a child. You signed the documents. I signed hospital paperwork. You signed everything. Linda folded her hands. Legally speaking, the house belongs to me now. Several relatives looked uncomfortable. Others avoided eye contact. One cousin quietly whispered, "Is that even possible?" Nathan answered confidently. Everything was done properly. Linda smiled again. Evelyn, sometimes emotions keep people from making good financial decisions. Then came the sentence that broke whatever trust remained. You should actually thank Nathan. I looked directly at my husband. For 12 years, I had believed this man would protect me. Instead, he had protected his sister, and somehow convinced an entire room that I should be grateful for it. Before I could respond, the front door opened. No one had expected another guest. Footsteps echoed across the hardwood floor. A calm voice asked, "Am I interrupting dinner?" Every head turned toward the entrance. The man standing there carried a worn leather briefcase. I recognized him instantly. It was the same attorney who had spoken to me in the hospital. And in his hand was a sealed blue envelope. The room fell so quiet that I could hear the grandfather clock in Linda's hallway ticking. Nathan's smile disappeared. Not dramatically, just slowly, as if every second gave him another reason to worry. The attorney closed the front door behind him and nodded politely. I apologize for arriving uninvited. No one answered. He looked directly at me. Mrs. Carter, I'm sorry it took me this long to reach you. Nathan stood up so quickly his chair scraped across the hardwood floor. This isn't an appropriate time. The attorney remained calm. Actually, Mr. Brooks, this is precisely the appropriate time. Linda crossed her arms. I'm afraid you're mistaken. This is private family business. He met her eyes without raising his voice. That depends on whose family business you're referring to. Then he lifted the blue envelope. My heart skipped. The same envelope my mother had tried to tell me about in the hospital. The attorney walked toward me instead of the head of the table. This was left by your father, with instructions that it be opened only after both he and your mother had passed away, and only in your presence. Nathan's face lost what little color it had left. He swallowed hard. I've never heard of that envelope. The attorney looked at him for a long moment. I know. Those two words landed harder than anyone expected. Linda forced a smile. Even if there's a letter, it doesn't change the property transfer. The attorney calmly placed the sealed envelope on the table. It may. No one moved. He carefully broke the wax seal. Inside were several folded documents and a handwritten letter in my father's unmistakable handwriting. For a moment I couldn't breathe. Seeing those familiar letters felt like hearing his voice again. The attorney unfolded the first page. Your father anticipated the possibility that someone might attempt to influence legal decisions after his death. Nathan interrupted. Objection, that's speculation. The attorney looked at him almost sympathetically. This isn't a courtroom. Then he continued reading. If you are hearing these words, then Margaret and I are together again. Evelyn, if anyone has convinced you that protecting this home required secrecy, remember what I taught you before breakfast every first Saturday. Honest people do not fear honest conversations. Tears filled my eyes. I remembered those mornings. The cold air. The toolbox. His voice. The attorney continued. The farmhouse is not merely land. It is family property that I intended to remain under my daughter's ownership. No person has my permission to transfer, assign, or conceal its ownership through deception. Nathan shifted uncomfortably. Linda no longer looked confident. The attorney placed the handwritten letter aside and lifted another document. This, he said quietly, is why I came. It wasn't another letter. It was a notarized affidavit. My father had signed it months before his death. Attached to it was a certified copy of a trust amendment. The attorney explained calmly. After updating his estate plan, your father instructed me to retain these originals separately from the documents kept at his residence. Nathan stared silently. The farmhouse, the attorney continued, was transferred into a protected family trust before Mr. Carter's death. Confused voices spread around the room. What does that mean? I thought Linda owned it. I don't understand. The attorney answered. It means Mr. Brooks could not legally transfer ownership that the trust already controlled. Linda's smile vanished completely. She looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at the table. For the first time all evening, neither of them spoke. The attorney reached into his briefcase one final time. I also brought copies of the county filing history. He laid several pages across the table. The signatures submitted after Mr. Carter's death attempted to transfer an interest that no longer existed. Someone quietly whispered. So, the paperwork. The attorney nodded. It had no legal effect. Nathan finally found his voice. There must be some misunderstanding. There isn't. I acted in good faith. The attorney looked directly at him. Then why was Mrs. Carter never informed? Nathan opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Linda tried to recover. We were only trying to protect the property. The attorney asked one simple question. From its lawful owner. No one answered. The silence was heavier than any argument could have been. Around the table, people began looking at Nathan and Linda differently. Not with anger at first. With realization. The story they had believed all evening no longer fit the facts. Nathan had spent months presenting himself as the responsible husband who handled difficult decisions. Now every "don't worry, I'll take care of it" sounded completely different. The attorney carefully gathered the documents. Then he looked at me. Mrs. Carter. I nodded. Your father left one final instruction. He handed me the handwritten letter. Folded inside was a single sentence written separately from the rest. In my father's careful handwriting, it read, "A house can be repaired after storms. Trust cannot, protect both wisely, but never confuse one for the other." I held the letter against my chest. Across the table, Nathan couldn't even look at me anymore. And for the first time since my father's death, I realized I hadn't lost everything. The house had been protected. Now it was time to decide whether my marriage could be. No one spoke for what felt like an entire minute. The silence wasn't awkward anymore. It was revealing. People who had spent the entire evening laughing at me suddenly became fascinated by their coffee cups, their dessert plates, or the pattern on the tablecloth. No one wanted to be the first person to admit they had believed the wrong story. Nathan finally cleared his throat. Evelyn, I can explain. His voice sounded different. Smaller. Not because he had become a different man in the last 5 minutes. Because the version of himself he had carefully built had collapsed. I looked at him calmly. For 12 years, every important decision in our marriage was supposed to be made together. He nodded. I know. So tell me. Another long pause. When exactly were you planning to tell me that my father's home had been placed in your sister's name? He rubbed his forehead. I was waiting for the right time. The right time. You were grieving. I've been grieving since Dad died. I didn't want to make things harder. I looked at him for several seconds before asking the only question that mattered. If the attorney had never walked through that door tonight, would you have ever told me? Nathan didn't answer. He couldn't. That silence became his answer. Linda suddenly leaned forward. This isn't entirely Nathan's fault. Every face turned toward her. I convinced him it was the safest option. Nathan looked shocked. You don't have to. No, she interrupted. Enough. She sighed deeply. I truly believed Evelyn wasn't prepared to manage the property. She looked at me for the first time all evening without confidence. I thought I was protecting an asset. I quietly replied. You weren't protecting an asset. You were protecting control. Linda lowered her eyes. That sentence seemed to reach her more than anything else. Uncle Richard spoke next. I owe you an apology, Evelyn. Then my cousin Melissa. So do I. One by one, people admitted they had accepted Nathan's version without ever asking me a single question. No dramatic speeches. No tears. Just uncomfortable honesty. Those apologies mattered. Not because they erased the past. Because they acknowledged it. The attorney stood. My work here is finished. I thanked him. Before leaving, he smiled gently. Your father trusted that truth eventually catches up with paperwork. Then he walked out. The front door closed quietly behind him. No dramatic music. No shouting. Just the sound of one honest man leaving after doing exactly what he'd promised another honest man he would do. I stood up. I'm going home. Nathan hurried after me. Evelyn, please. I stopped near the doorway. I don't want another explanation. I love you. I nodded slowly. I believe you think you do. His eyes filled with tears. But love without respect becomes permission. He had no answer. That night I drove alone to the farmhouse. For the first time since my parents passed away, the house didn't feel empty. It felt peaceful. I walked onto the old porch where my father had taught me to hammer nails straight. I unlocked the front door. Inside, everything remained exactly where my parents had left it. Their photographs. My mother's quilt. My father's reading glasses resting beside his favorite chair. I sat there until sunrise. Not crying. Thinking. Over the following weeks, I met with the attorney several times. Every document was reviewed carefully. The trust remained exactly as my father intended. The attempted transfer was formally withdrawn from the public record after the appropriate legal filings. No headlines. No courtroom drama. Just quiet corrections. Nathan asked to meet me dozens of times. Eventually, I agreed. We met at a small coffee shop halfway between our homes. He looked exhausted. I never wanted to steal anything. I believe that. He seemed surprised. But you wanted to decide what belonged to me. He looked down. I thought I knew better. I know. I was trying to solve problems. You created one instead. He nodded. I don't expect forgiveness. I answered honestly. Forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. Months later, our marriage officially ended. Not because of one document. Because of years of small decisions that had taught me my voice mattered less than his judgment. The document simply revealed what had already been true. Linda wrote me a handwritten letter nearly 6 months later. She apologized without excuses. She admitted that winning had become more important than being fair. I appreciated the honesty. Whether reconciliation was possible would take much longer. As for the farmhouse, I restored it slowly. The porch was repaired. The old barn was reinforced. The roof was replaced. But I kept the worn toolbox my father carried every first Saturday morning. It still sits by the front door. Whenever my nieces and nephews visit, I tell them the same sentence my father told me. Character is built before breakfast. They laugh the same way I once did. Maybe one day they'll understand it too. A year after everything happened, my former employer invited me back, not just as a financial controller but as chief financial officer. During the announcement, the company's chairman introduced me with words I never expected to hear. Evelyn Carter is someone whose integrity becomes stronger under pressure. The room applauded. I smiled. Not because of the promotion. Because I knew my father would have cared far more about that sentence than the title. Looking back now, I don't think my story was ever really about a house. The house was only the stage. The real story was about a system. A system where one person quietly takes over every decision because everyone else assumes they know best. A system where trust is mistaken for weakness. A system where silence slowly replaces partnership. Those systems don't collapse because someone shouts. They collapse when the truth finally has documents, witnesses, and the courage to be opened. My father understood that long before I did. That's why he left the blue envelope. Not because he expected betrayal. Because he understood that honesty should never depend on memory alone. Sometimes it needs evidence. Sometimes it needs patience. And sometimes justice doesn't arrive with anger. It arrives with one sealed envelope, one honest lawyer, and the quiet certainty that lies eventually run out of places to hide. Tell me in the comments, if you had been sitting at that dinner table, at what moment would you have realized something was terribly wrong? And if you enjoyed this story, subscribe and I'll see you in the next one. The next spring, I hosted the first family gathering at the farmhouse since my parents had passed away. Not because everything had been repaired. Because I realized healing doesn't wait until life looks perfect. The porch still had one section of fresh lumber that hadn't yet weathered to match the rest of the house. The barn still needed paint. Several rooms remained exactly as my mother had left them because I wasn't ready to change them. That was all right. Some things deserve time. I invited everyone. Even Linda. Even Nathan. Whether they came would be their decision. On Saturday afternoon, cars slowly began pulling into the driveway. My cousins arrived first. Then Uncle Richard. Then Aunt Carol carrying one of my mother's old casserole recipes she'd found tucked inside a church cookbook. People spoke more quietly than they used to. Not because they were uncomfortable. Because the house itself seemed to ask for honesty. Linda arrived alone. She stood near the porch for almost a full minute before walking toward me. I wasn't sure you'd actually invite me. I wasn't sure you'd come. She gave a small smile. I almost didn't. There was another pause. Then she handed me a small wooden box. Inside were dozens of old family photographs. Pictures I'd thought had disappeared after my father's death. I found these while cleaning out some storage boxes, she said. I should have returned them months ago. I looked through them carefully. There was one photograph of me at 8 years old standing beside my father with a hammer that looked far too large for my hands. Another showed my mother laughing while flour covered half the kitchen. I smiled. Thank you. Linda nodded once. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She simply returned what belonged to me. Sometimes that's where rebuilding begins. Nathan arrived nearly an hour later. He looked thinner than I remembered. His confidence had been replaced by something quieter. Humility, perhaps. He stayed near the edge of the yard, speaking mostly with Uncle Richard. No one ignored him. No one surrounded him either. People simply treated him like someone who needed to earn his place again. Late in the afternoon, he walked over while I was replacing a loose porch screw. He looked at the toolbox beside me. Your father's? Yes. He smiled sadly. I remember him teaching me how to replace fence posts. So do I. I should have listened more carefully. I kept working. After a few moments he asked, "Do you ever miss us?" I stopped turning the screwdriver. I miss who I believed we were. He closed his eyes briefly. I understand. For the first time in a long time, neither of us tried to convince the other of anything. Truth no longer needed defending. It simply existed. As evening approached, my youngest nephew ran across the yard, carrying one of my father's old baseball gloves. "Aunt Evelyn, what is it? Can you show me how Grandpa fixed things?" I laughed. "I can try." Together we replaced an old gate hinge. It took nearly 20 minutes. Mostly because he asked 100 questions. When we finished, he looked proudly at the gate swinging smoothly. "We fixed it." I smiled. "No. What? We repaired it. What's the difference?" I thought about my father, then answered the way I imagined he would have. When something is fixed, people often forget it was ever broken. And repaired. You remember the damage, but you also remember the work it took to make it strong again. He nodded as though he completely understood. Maybe he did. Maybe he would someday. That evening, after everyone left, I sat alone on the porch watching the sunset settle behind the old maple trees. The farmhouse looked exactly as it always had. Yet somehow, it felt completely different. Not because ownership had changed. Because fear had. For months I had believed losing the house would mean losing my parents all over again. I was wrong. Their values had never been stored inside the walls. They had been stored inside the choices they taught me to make. No forged signature could steal that. No secret transfer could erase it. No betrayal could rewrite it. I locked the front door just before going inside. As I reached for the light switch, I noticed the blue envelope framed on the hallway wall. Not as a reminder of betrayal. As a reminder of preparation. My father hadn't spent his life expecting the worst from people. He had simply believed that truth deserved protection. Now, every time I passed that frame, I remembered something far more valuable than the farmhouse itself. Real inheritance isn't measured in acres. It's measured in integrity. And unlike property, integrity can never be signed away. Years have passed since that dinner, and every now and then someone asks me the same question. Do you regret trusting Nathan? It's an understandable question. But it's the wrong one. Trust wasn't my mistake. Trusting someone who repeatedly asked me to surrender my voice was. There's a difference. When I look back now, I don't start with the blue envelope. I don't start with the lawyer. I don't even start with the night everyone laughed at me. I start much earlier. I remember every time I said, "Whatever you think is best." Every time I signed something without reading it because I was tired. Every time I convinced myself that asking questions might sound disrespectful. Those moments seemed insignificant. Together they became a pattern. A healthy marriage doesn't require one person to become smaller, so the other can feel more capable. A healthy family doesn't confuse silence with harmony. And real love never asks someone to give up informed consent in the name of convenience. The farmhouse has become something unexpected. Not a monument to the past. A place for the future. Every autumn, the neighborhood children come to carve pumpkins in the old barn. Every December, we host a community dinner using my mother's recipes. Every first Saturday of the month, I wake up early. Sometimes I work alone. Sometimes my nieces and nephews join me. Before we pick up a hammer or a paintbrush, I tell them the same sentence that shaped my childhood. Character is built before breakfast. They smile. They roll their eyes. They tease me the way I once teased my father. And I smile back because I know that one day when life tests them, they'll hear those words again. Just as I did. Not as a memory. As a guide. The old fireproof box still sits in my father's study. Inside are the original trust papers, family photographs, my mother's handwritten recipes, and the blue envelope. Whenever I add something important to that box, I think about how easy it is for paper to preserve facts. People often believe justice is loud. In my experience, it usually isn't. Justice is often a quiet correction. A document filed honestly. A lie that can no longer survive daylight. An apology offered without excuses. A boundary finally respected. Those moments rarely make headlines. But they change lives. Sometimes I drive past the hospital where my mother spent her final months. I no longer feel the crushing weight I once carried. Instead, I remember holding her hand when she whispered her last word. Home. For a long time, I believed she meant the farmhouse. Now I think she meant something much larger. A place where truth lives. A place where love doesn't require fear. A place where no one has to earn the right to be heard. That became my home long before I repaired the porch or repainted the barn. It became my home the moment I stopped apologizing for asking questions. If this story leaves you with one thought, let it be this. Read what you sign. Ask the uncomfortable question. Protect the people you love, but never surrender your voice while doing it. Because the strongest families are not built on blind trust. They're built on honest conversations, shared responsibility, and the courage to tell the truth even when it's inconvenient. And in the end, that was the greatest inheritance my parents